Good evening and welcome. My name is Gabriel Goldstein. I am the interim director and chief curator at Yeshiva University Museum. And we at the museum, alongside Leo Beck Institute, feel very privileged to be able to present this film this evening and to have this conversation with you. I also must say that this is particularly meaningful to me because for the past several years, I've had the privilege of working with the Claims Conference as the project director and consulting curator for an exhibition marking the 70th anniversary of the Luxembourg Agreement, which featured its first presentation at the Bundestag, marking 70 years, which was opened by President Herzog, who you saw speak on the film. So I have a personal involvement in this storyline and in the keeping of this history and telling it to the public. We will have opportunity this evening to hear from 3 speakers who have an interest in this area and help us to understand the film and the storyline and the concept of reparations. In order to start our conversation this evening, what I'm going to do is to introduce each of them in sequence and pose a single question to each of them to get their own ideas about the film and about the history. And then we'll have some more conversation together among the 4 of us, as well as opening it up for questions from all of you. So thank you once again for joining us this evening. I'd like to first introduce Karen Heilig, who you saw on the film. Karen is the producer of the film and serves as the Assistant Executive Vice President of the Claims Conference and General Counsel. Since 1999, she has participated in the negotiations between the Claims Conference and the German government. Karen, I'm wondering if you can help us to understand why it was so important to make this film now.
Thank you. I think there's a few reasons. Firstly, obviously, this year is a very significant year because it represents 70 years since the actual negotiations in 1952. But more importantly, I think you can see that many of those who were in the film, who were vital to the film, such as Ben Ferenc and Bettina Adenauer and Yaakov Sheret, had really significant contributions, and we wanted to capture their first-hand experiences and include those in the film. But just as importantly, I think we were very committed to putting the views of survivors throughout the film. And I think the survivors who, Helena Weinreich, for example, who you saw in the movie, and dancing at the end, is a very young 98. But as you can see, they're also not so young. And we felt it really was critical to show the story not just from the perspective of the German government and the State of Israel and the Claims Conference, but really to integrate how the survivors felt immediately after liberation, about the issues of receiving funds from the German government, and really what it meant to them in their lives. And I think the impact of the film is so much more powerful because we were able to have the survivors in it. And obviously, doing this film in 20 years, we may not have had that opportunity. I just wanted to say before that we're also, the Claims Conference, the film was a sort of a challenge for us to make now because, and I think we were very lucky to have a very talented filmmaker, Roberta Grossman, make the film, because I think the film showed both the perspective of the German government and of the Claims Conference, which was not always the same, and she captured all sides. And to that end, I want to give recognition to Anna Geritz, who's here today from the German Finance Ministry, who happened to be in New York just now, just coincidentally, because I think it was a very unique opportunity for the filmmaker to be able to get input from both sides and really then come out with something that was really independent.
Thank you, Karen. Next, Anton. Anton Klix serves as the head of the political section of the German Consulate in New York City. He holds a law degree from Albert Ludwig University in Freiburg in Breisgau. And he served previously in an international law firm in Munich and in the German Office for International Cooperation in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. Prior to his transfer to New York, he served in a variety of roles in the Federal Foreign Office. Anton, I wonder if you can help us to understand better kind of the evolution and development of the acceptance of the Luxembourg Agreement in German politics and in German society in general?
I think it was shown quite well in the film how difficult it was for Konrad Adenauer to make clear how important it was for Germany, but also morally, globally, to have these negotiations and to end up with what we know as the Luxembourg agreements. There were, in 1952, it was just 7 years after the end of World War II, and Germany still was in ruins. People were struggling, and it wasn't as clear as today that there was this moral obligation to do these reparations or compensation, or Wiedergutmachung, which is the German word, and I know it's not throughout accepted for good reasons. And there was a development over the years, and now we have it as a common sense, actually, in German politics, that there is not a collective guilt, but there is a collective responsibility. And that is where we're standing now, and I think that is where we're heading in the future. And this is also why there is no end, actually. There's no end for this compensation, because it not only has the material component, but also the moral component.
Thank you. I think that's very profound to understand that the agreement was formed at a certain moment, but then it really has this impact over generations. Finally, as I pose these questions and introduce our panelists, Elazar Barkan is the professor of international and public affairs and the director of the Human Rights Concentration at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. Almost 25 years ago, Elazar wrote the book Guilt of Nations, which is one of the first major studies to look at the storyline of Holocaust reparations and the Luxembourg agreements, and really is a seminal thinker in terms of the role of reparations and reconciliation in the international sphere. Anton, I think I'd like to have you help us understand the development of what's novel of this reparations agreement. How did it actually change Germany? And then think a little more broadly about the comparative or global impact of this agreement, the Luxembourg Agreement, and the ongoing evolution of that storyline, and how it affects not only this one moment, but a larger understanding of history and society.
Thank you. Good evening. The first thing I want to say is that the movie is really good. Can you hear me? Okay. Undersold the movie, or the reviews of it, undersold the importance of the movie, because it shows with great subtlety a lot of components which are becoming part of the narrative, but analytically is really important. Let me start by saying that when I wrote the book 25 years ago, this was part of transitional justice and historical dialogue, because apologies become a concept that is actually very widespread. And when Adenauer said this was not at all accepted, it was complete novelty. Apologies, political apologies are quite frequent today. When you see that Adenauer said in his apology, he said, crimes committed by the German in the name of the German nation. He didn't say crime committed by Germany. This is very important because it shows how limited was the recognition. And what is more important, I think, is that this is the first time in history, and it shows that it's fatal, not only to individuals, but it was given out of the moral compunction of the perpetrators. Reparation and restitution has been existed forever, but that was by the victors imposing on the losers. That goes to the Old Testament, if you want, as one place where you find it. But here in this case, the German parliament, headed by Adenauer, managed to say that the guilt is, the responsibility is Germany's, and although it was enforced by the Allies, they accepted it. This has become, on this, the relationship between Israel and Germany were built and progressed, and achieving reparation was not a place. It's not that you achieve reparation and go home, but actually it established a profound relationship between Israel and Germany. And since then, there's been a lot of Eastern Europe after the Soviet bloc was disintegrated, after the end of the Cold War. We in the United States now face the question of reparation for slavery and for racial. Reparation has become a comprehensive space where historical dialogue takes place. I will say one more thing, or maybe I'll leave it till later. We don't want to go with it.
No, finish your thought, please.
Germany did not embrace the responsibility in 1952. It embraced the responsibility. This was more a political issue in 1952. Only in the 70s, when the 68ers took control of Germany, the next generation, then it became a core of German identity. The reparations were part of a policy, but it was more important for German identity and for German culture than for anybody else. Maybe that would be it.
It's very powerful. So I posed a different question to each of you, and now I think before we open it up, I want to pose the same question to all three of you. And that is that each of you in the audience, when you go home tonight or tomorrow, you're going to say, I saw a film. And what do you want these people here to share in terms of the lesson that they bring from the film forward to share with someone else? What do you want them to understand as a core message that they should then take and spread that word? We go in the same order.
I think one of the things that sort of resonates is if we think about it, and I think Elazar touched on it sort of briefly, and perhaps Anton as well, is that this was done 7 years after the end of the Shoah, after the end of the Holocaust. And if you can imagine, and the film tries to touch on it, what it was like between the Germans and the Jewish people at that stage, and yet they managed to sit down and to somehow deal with what could have been an unsolvable and intractable problem. And I think it perhaps gives us a little bit of hope that when people we can't talk to each other, we can't solve problems, perhaps there is hope that if they could do it then, that we as a society, when things are difficult and when problems seem insurmountable, perhaps we can also as a society find a way to make bridges and to talk about it.
Anton?
Yes.
Can you top that one? That's
Yeah.
tough.
Difficult. I'll try probably something similar in other words, but really in this situation where people were talking about like the darkest chapter in mankind, and every one of these people who sat together in Luxembourg were affected personally. They had lost family members through the Holocaust. They were somehow inflicted because their own families, maybe own friends, people they knew, their nation, had been the perpetrators. But they sat together and actually, in spite of all these obstacles, they managed to come to a maybe not perfect agreement, but like a very improbably well negotiated agreement. And that, I think, is something that can give hope, as Karen said, that if these people manage to do so, this can really be somehow a role model for other difficult situations in global politics, I guess.
I just want to add one thing, that as the Jewish world, I think one of the things, the Jewish world is very divided. And the Claims Conference has 26 organizations that are very different, from Agudat Yisrael to the World Union of Progressive Judaism, from left to right, religiously, politically. And I think that Nachum Goldman said in his autobiography that he was, he felt that what people could achieve when people are united, where the Jewish people are united with one vision and one mission. And to me, that always, that resonates very much, and for all of us as well.
I'll make 2 points. The first one is, I hope that people remember the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, headed by Desmond Tutu in the 90s. Desmond Tutu, Archbishop, insisted that people who need to forgive, because as a Catholic bishop, he saw that forgiveness is essential to his society. This is completely different in this case, because forgiveness, would never imagine, as it's mentioned in the book, could never be in the book, in the movie, could never be imagined, and yet you can build a relationship without forgiveness, without imposing on the victims additional burden that they need to forgive the perpetrator. Just like there is a differentiation between responsibility and guilt, so is the responsibility whether forgetting, forgiving, or not forgiving is part of the relationship that is being built. My second point.
We'll get to it. So that gives you all quite a profound agenda as you go home to spread the word. I'd like to then now invite the audience to have questions. We have a microphone, and we'll take those for any of the panelists in particular, or for us as a group.
30 seconds to say.
Okay. Please.
Just 30 seconds. We are responsible for our past, whether we belong to a corporate, to a state. It's not a matter of whether we individually were involved in the crimes, but I think it's a challenge for the Jewish world to be more forthcoming for African American reparations, and to make that as a symbol, to make the reparation from Germany as a symbol for our commitment to human rights and to responsibility for the past, not just to the future.
Thank you for this meaningful presentation and talk. My question is about what was for me a very painful moment in the film, and that was when we learned that Roja, the aunt of Irene Weiss, was denied by that doctor, was denied her claim. My question is, was there any, do we know of any follow-up? Did she reapply? Was there any compensation given during the aunt's lifetime or afterwards? I know people who have applied several times until they were successful.
The programs that were in the 1950s and the 1960s, the original programs, did have those requirements to go to to doctors to have certified the cause of why they were sick. However, the new programs that were started after the reunification of Germany in 1990, these programs no longer had any of those requirements. All the applicants, the survivors, had a much more simplified application process. It's in many languages, not longer only in German. They just have to say where they were, and the claims conference helps prove where they are. And there's definitely this requirement of going to a doctor is no longer there. So thankfully, many of the requirements were changed from the 1990s, and that helped a lot of survivors apply at that time.
Karen, why don't you just briefly summarize the expansion of the reparations program and as the increased sensitivity to survivor experience, and that's part of this evolution over the 70 years?
So many of the new programs, the initial programs had a deadline of 31st of December 1969. But at that stage, there were many survivors who in those early years either didn't want to apply or they couldn't apply because at that stage they were behind the Iron Curtain and couldn't apply. However, for the new programs that started in 1990, one of the differences was that the claims conference was administering the program, and the program it was very much moved from a program that was very victim sensitive to make it as easy as possible for the survivors, because there was a recognition that every time a survivor applies, they're reliving a trauma. Every time you have to describe what happened to you and where you were and what your story was, it's reliving a trauma. And there was a real sensitivity to that. So as much as possible, the program has tried to be as easy and sensitive and open, and that has really been a development during the last 35, 40 years.
One thing that needs to be absolutely clear is reparation is symbolic. The reparation do not able to return to make the Wiedergutmachung. It doesn't make anything whole. See, we are talking about the worst crimes in human history. Not just German Jewish, but genocides in general. Rwanda, Bosnia, in many places, slavery. So to try to approximate the monetary value of the reparation is symbolic. It could not be embraced and say, I owe more. And the fact that many were denied and did not receive any reparation is more the rule, the norm, than the exception.
Maybe I can also just add a word on the word of Wiedergutmachung, to make whole, because it may seem strange that this word actually was used and is still in use, and I think the genesis is actually historically, because it was kind of a try to make Germans understand about the moral obligation, and that was I think to separate it from reparations that were paid because of war crimes, for example, to many other countries. And no one really thinks that there is a way to make whole these injustices. And because of that, it is also like an ongoing obligation, and it will not stop, not even with, unfortunately, the sinking numbers of survivors that are still there. So the support of survivors is going to somehow change to another support, which means Holocaust education. Most of all this, and also there's another component of compensation through the visibility of survivors and their history in compensation. So there's a whole project that already has started that lots of information is going to be uploaded and to be made public. And this is kind of the evolution of compensation.
Yes, I just felt, having lived through that period, having come from Germany as a youth child in '33, and then having lived through the wars in Israel, I just was wondering here, number 4, the most important question is this film available to somehow to the general public? I mean, I think this should be, let's say, in cinemas in Israel and cinemas in the United States. I don't know if it's available.
So let Karen talk about its distribution.
Also, I think I see now the reparations in the after having watched this in detail in a different eye. I really see the international, the historical value as a precedent, indeed, as was mentioned here already, to a world precedent. I mean, real precedent. I don't know that there was anything in reparations. There were certain reparations for Japanese, let's say, in the United States, and here and there, but not really very many. And I think this is an enormously, it's more than what only happened to our people who were damaged by the Nazis, but it's really, they see it now as the international general story.
So if I can assign responses, I'm going to ask Karen to speak about the film itself and its distribution, and then Elazar to give a comment about this idea of precedent.
Basically, the aim of the film is after it's been to film festivals, with television broadcast. That is, rather than cinema release, the aim is to go on things like PBS, public television, within the next year, and hopefully that will read, and then streaming after that. So that is the sort of the distribution plan.
How many film festivals so far?
In Israel, it's having its premiere on the 21st of December, and after it's been already 2 television stations in Israel will be screening the film.
Precedent.
Precedent. So as you notice, the movie says that Israel in the claims conference claimed 1 billion in '52. It's been over 100 billion since then, with different rates, etc. So it's a process, and the process is gave precedent for many countries, and when it's not followed, it is criticized, like the Japanese not compensating the sexual slaves of the military during the war, of Nanjing. So whenever we have conflict and discussion about reparation, whoever we are, this is always refers to Germany as the gold standard of why Japan cannot do reparation like Germany. We have to remember that although 100 billion is relatively a large sum of money, it's over 70 years. It's peanuts compared to GNP, compared to the crimes. So it's really what it does describe is goodwill and as a precedent for doing something that you don't have to, but you're obliged to do it because of moral commitment.
There's a dimension you didn't get into, and that's German industry. German companies ran concentration camps next to government-run concentration camps and rented out slave labor from the SS. What happened to these companies? What happened, like IG Farben and some of the other companies after the war? Was it back to business as usual? I know that American companies also made money on the war and traded with German companies. But was it business? And where did the money come from that the government, the German government paid reparations from? Was it from these same industrialists? who got right back where they were before the war and who had supported Hitler before the war.
Are you gathering questions?
Yeah. In the year 2000, there was an agreement, but again, I put onto the point, to pay symbolic payments. It was an agreement to establish a foundation paid for by German industry to make payments to people who'd been slave laborers and forced laborers and other and victims of medical experiments and others who had suffered at the hands of German industry. Again, that was in the year 2000 that program was established. But again, the payments were symbolic. But I think more than the symbolism, it had people recognized. Those Jews and non-Jews who had suffered at the hands of German industry at least had their suffering, their special suffering at the hands of industry recognized. And while, again, no money will ever make up, there was also, many of these companies did do as part of this process some self-examination. Some companies did more than some companies did than others did. But I think that there is a recognition of that issue, and I think and something was done.
I would point out that part of the evolution of the reparations process has been an evolution of empowerment and recognition of survivors. And it's something that we dealt with in the film to some extent, and we dealt with in the exhibition project. And over the course of the recent decades, since over the 70 years, we see increased recognition of new communities who previously weren't recognized as, quote, Holocaust survivors, and in the pain and suffering they endured, and then their kind of recognition and empowerment. So they literally were at the negotiation table. And that includes people who were involved as slave laborers, people who were experienced as hidden children, and things that I think almost for now we take for granted as being Holocaust survivors, but that wasn't the case in 1952. So this idea of evolution over 70 years of recognition happened in a variety of communities that's very important.
Okay.
Perhaps we should first of all acknowledge the German industry got away with murder. The reparation that the German industry and capital paid was very minimal. In 2000, it was part of the agreement. Most of it, about half, was from the German corporations and half by the government. It was mostly directed to Eastern Europe, slave laborers, mostly non-Jews, and that was the final big agreement. There were some exceptions to that. The companies that investigated their own through creating commissions that established the history of the company under Nazism. But even there, in 1992, after the fall of the Soviet Union, East Germany was giving compensation to East Germany. And one of the companies that demanded reparation was the one that produced the Cyclone B. And they asked for reparation because their property was taken over. So it's not all shine and it's not all positive. Reparation is a more complicated topic.
Okay. My parents were both Holocaust survivors. My mother received Wiedergutmachung. My father was running a factory for the German war effort headed by a Romanian colonel in Hermannstadt, which is Romania. He never received any Wiedergutmachung. My mother died in 2003, and we were recently contacted, my sister and I, by the German Commission über eine Nachzahlung, and I was wondering, I think you might be able to speak about that. What is the Nachzahlung, and why is it now, after more than 20 years since my mother has died, that they're looking into, since the majority of Holocaust survivors have already died, what is the Nachzahlung about, and who made that determination to give a final payment?
I'm sorry, it's a too technical question for me, actually. I would have to find it out, and maybe you should just leave me your email address. I'm very happy to investigate and come back to you on this.
I just want to get back to what the panel were talking. It's been 77 years since the World War II, and there were since then there were genocides in Africa, Rwanda, Cambodia, and this model can never be replicated again. So I'm just asking: is this the exception rather than the rule, in which the repatriation of money? I don't see it coming. In fact, the more violence and the people knowing the genocides are ongoing and being recorded even at the real time, and we can't get reparation for the victim. So I'm just asking, is this unlikely to be replicated again?
Replicated, no. What is it? It's a precedent. Depends what aspect of reparation you take. If you take about the amount of money, I don't think so. Although if African American will receive reparation, it will be a much bigger number. But the precedent that it is, and this is replicated, is the feeling of commitment for past crimes, whether it's museums, whether it's acknowledgement, whether it's politics, indigenous people getting. It's much. There are at least 5 aspects to reparation. Some of them are more symbolic. Hard cash, it won't be replicated. But to give you an example, for Lakota tribe, Lakota people in the Black Hills in South Dakota received in the mid-80s agreement in millions of dollars to be paid as reparation. They didn't want the reparation money, they wanted the land. And it's still not being resolved. Victims are never satisfied, and it's rightly so. So I think what the German reparation can teach us is how to address it when we feel as a society that is morally obligated to amend its crimes, that this would become that this has become, and it is explored in different ends of conflict.
It's already 8:30, so I wanted to take, I think, 2 more questions.
Hi, I just wanted to thank you all for answering our questions and staying behind. First of all, I'm Jewish and all my family is Jewish, and my dad is from Israel, so I wanted to preface that before this question. But
So can I ask you to speak up, because it's harder with the mask.
okay. Just seeing how helpful and transformative reparations have been for the Jewish community and Jewish people all around the world, what do you feel is our responsibilities as Jews for reparations towards African Americans, as Elazar was mentioning before, and also reparations towards Palestinian displacement by Israel?
The last sentence was for Palestinians in Israel.
Yes.
Okay.
You're the broad global analysis here.
So I think, with regard to African Americans, I think that there has to be a political push, and there is much growing. In my institute, we have a project of skill building and capacity building for various civil society organizations of how to handle reparations and demand for reparations. And some of it is done at the local level, state level, regional level. What it hasn't been done is at the federal level. But there are hundreds of organizations and projects that talk about, and there is momentum to build this. I think that the Jewish world would be much rewarded if it would take building a bridge with the African American community and not looking always just for anti-Semitism, but actually for the groups around African Americans who are operating in a different way. The second question, Palestinian and Israel, I don't know if I want to comment because I don't think you want to hear what I think of the Israeli government. But I think that it's complete divorce. The fact that the Israeli government exploits the Holocaust and it rejects any criticism for its own action is unspeakable. And I'll stop at this.
Our last question of the evening.
And if I can just make a comment for people who are interested in the question of not so much reparations for African Americans specifically, but a sort of comparative look at memory culture and this idea of historic responsibility that was spoken about in the film that all the panelists have mentioned. In Germany, as potentially applied to the memory and understanding of historic injustices against African Americans. We just had a program with a very interesting organization called Widen the Circle, and it featured a local historian from Germany who's led lots of projects with students and other local citizens researching the Jewish history of their hometowns, who was in conversation with a scholar named Carlos Hill at the University of Oklahoma, who's been doing similar work around the Tulsa race massacre in 1921. And they had a fascinating conversation about their experiences working with people, training teachers, working with students, and also resistance they encountered in the communities that they're working in. So go to YouTube. The easiest way to find this would be go to youtube.com/Leo Baeck Institute, and I think it was our second most recent program. But I think we had one more question, right? Ma'am, did you have something? Okay. Thanks for indulging that. But you should really check out that program.
Do you think if anyone but Adenauer had been chancellor, that history would have unfolded as it did?
That's a question that we can do in numerous ways, the what if. But instead of that, I'll answer that the vote in the Bundestag, Adenauer received the SPD support and not the CDU. So his own party did not support him, and he was supported by the Social Democrats. In addition to that, Germany did not have official diplomatic relations with Israel, and it always committed, and it also followed the reparation agreement. And Adenauer moved it through some rough waters, and it was really his own determination. I can't see it happening under another person, but what do we know? I can't. His own personal role and personal commitment and moral, rather than realpolitik, I think cannot be overstated.
I think he was an extraordinary person. I think part of his party did support it. There was a split with the CDU and CSU, but he did need 100% of the SPD, of the Social Democrats, to pass it. But part of his party did. But I think he was just extraordinary. And I think that we were very lucky in the film to get that insight into him from his granddaughter, which was really phenomenal. And I worked with Saul Kagan, who was one of the people who's in the film and was at the negotiations. And he told me about how the fact that Adonai went to the chapel and prayed just after the negotiations were signed. And, 50, 60, 70 years later, I remember Saul telling me that, and I really think it was a moment in time.
He was a religious person. He was opposed to Nazism. He came from Cologne, had was friends with many Jews from there, and he had that mixture between being a realist and saw how important it was for Germany to come back into the moral, intact international community, but also he saw how the moral obligation was obvious to him, and he was a type of leader who could somehow convey this knowledge he had to the parliament and form a majority that was needed so badly. And there were several questions actually about the uniqueness of this situations and if it could be transformed to other conflicts. And I think it is, to be optimistic, it would be good to to think that it is possible. And this is this one thing, never again. This is what we try to take from these huge injustices from the Holocaust. And but it is very, very difficult. You see all the conflicts that are still existing, and if it were so easy to take the lessons from history to the present and the future, we would be living in a better world, I think. But also, you have to see how unique the situation was, how desperate Germany was to come back to the international community, and how, on the other side, how big the needs for Israel and for the individuals were that were taken everything in the Holocaust and needed support. So this was all, I think, that had to come together for this story to unfold how it did in history.
I think the film did an amazing job in showing how torturous and gut-wrenching a process it was to create this. How difficult it was, the kind of battles that were internal within Germany, the battles that were on the street and vociferous in Israel, and that resounded over generations, the debates at the claims conference as it was being formed, and the debates around the table internally. People wanted to leave and walk away. And I think that's a lot of the message we're taking in terms of this as precedent, is that it wasn't easy, and it wasn't easy over the next decades as well. But it was impactful in so many ways. And that's what's really inspiring. And I want you all to remember when you go home what you heard from everyone here as to how to spread that word. Because that really is the impact beyond the film and of this experience over decades. I want to thank all of our panelists here today. I want to thank all of you for coming to see the film. On behalf of Yeshiva University Museum, and if I may, on behalf of Leo Baeck Institute, thank you. We have lessons we've learned, and we have a pathway into the future. Good evening.